this past weekend, me and my partner decided to go to our usual camping spot. It's very low-key, never usually anyone up this mountain besides 1 or 2 people at a time. And even at that time, they're miles away from your campground. It's not a well-known spot. This past weekend, just like every year, we brought my parents' little elderly dog. Set up camp, ate some food, and drank some beer around the campsite. When we arrived prior to this, we scoped out the area to see how busy it was. There was absolutely nobody in sight. The entire mountain campgrounds were entirely empty. We used to have one hunter or fisher in the area at least. We've never not seen at least one person the entire trip. So we sat around the fire, completely relaxed with my little dog nearby. When we decide to get into bed, my usually very complacent, placid pup refuses to settle inside the tent. It's pretty hot this time of year, so we had the tent unzipped with just the mesh covering the opening to let some breeze in. But my pup was looking through the mesh and sniffing, zoning in on something entirely. We decide to get up and check out the camp for whatever he's looking at. We don't see anything, so we decide to sit by the fire to fire us out when my sleepy pup unsettles suddenly with his hackles straight up on end, growling a deep growl into one direction of the woods. We decided to grab the hunting knife and axe and listen. He's snarling and barking vigorously, which took us by surprise because he's been completely comfortable every other year. After a few hours of him acting on high alert, we decide to flip the truck lights on to illuminate our camp as we're surrounded by darkness. We were listening intently, trying to figure out what he's seeing or hearing. After a few minutes, he lays down and alarms us again a few minutes later, startling us to the point we make a run for the truck by how aggressively my dog is warning something. We wait, hearts pounding inside the truck, trying to see what's out there. After 30 minutes, we assume whatever it is has passed on. After we reposition ourselves in front of the fire again, my dog's hackles are up, and we hear the loudest tree branch snap a mere 10 feet away from us, in the pitch-black wilderness. Again, we hop in the truck with the dog and decide we better leave, as earlier that night we were hearing wolves hunting for a few hours and their howls echoing through the woods. Our main concern was it being a cougar, as they're commonly seen in this area, and there had been a lot of attacks on unsuspecting victims. Our main thought was something was stalking us for a long time without moving on. We told my partner's parents that we decided it's better to be safe than sorry, and we were mocked extensively, but we were armed with very minimal weapons. Not anything that would handle a mountain lion or a pack of wolves. We were called chicken shits the entire weekend and mocked over it. I also felt protective over my dog, as he's very small story too. I was camping in Nebraska, Ohio, by myself. I was on third and final night there, woke up to piss. Walked about 10 feet from my hammock, and noticed a headlamp about 8,100 feet from me. I watched it for about 10 minutes. I watched him stand up, sit down. I got my boots on and grabbed my hatchet and started to walking to the right of my campsite. I was going to find out what he was up to. I got about 50 wide ease from my sight and started walking towards him when I noticed another headlamp, about 40 FT from me, and walking around. I hit the ground and threw some leaves on me. He walked about 10 feet from where I was laying. Then he stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished his beer. He threw his can on the ground. After he got far enough that he couldn't hear me, I got up and started walking towards the first guy. I got close enough to him that I can hear his phone receiving messages. I moved up closer to him quietly to where I can see his face lit up from his cell phone. That's when he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. I laid there on the ground for a minute and made my way towards my site. I stopped when I started hearing my tarp that I had above my hammock being trashed. Then I can see flashlights, and then my big flashlight turn on and off. I heard my mess kit being thrown in them, talking about how he was just here. I laid on the ground and watched my flashlight walk away until it was a small dim light. When the sun came up and I returned, my whole site was destroyed. My hammock and tarp was shredded by what looked like a machete. My mess kit was stomped on. They took my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight. I went to the spot where I seen the first guy and found chew pouches, 8 empty beer can, and an empty lighter. I walked to where I seen the other guy and found an empty bag of powder, which turned up to be meth, a mess of cigarette butts, and a pile of shit with no toilet paper to be found. A friend and I decided to take our first backpacking trip together. It was late June along the PCT in the North Cascades. The trail still had snow once you hiked above a couple thousand feet. After 3 days of novice snow navigation, we thought we could drive farther south to White Pass and ditch the snow. It hailed and poured half the drive down, so it was a lucky decision and great timing. We parked the car and chatted with a random hiker that keyed asking about our car and our gear. We wanted to know everything about us, and he accidentally overheard me saying he was crazy. He glared at us as we drove away, when we finally started up trail after he left. The weather had lightened up, but it was already around 4 or 5 p.m. The trail was covered in horse manure, until about 1.5 HRs into hiking when we started getting to large patches of snow. We started post-holing, our feet dropping 6-10 inches deep into snow depending on the step. We finally reached where the horse tracks and footprints stopped. Buff had to keep going to find camp. The sun started to set. We began bickering about whether we turn back or keep moving forward. There was no good place to sleep in either direction. We pushed forward and are met with a small clearing where we could set our tents up in the snow. As we finally settle down and get the tents set up, we notice bear tracks through the snow. We start looking at the trees and notice bark is torn off everywhere and they're covered in claw marks. We found bear droppings and different sized tracks near our tents. We freak out realizing we need to hang our food really good and have little time. There is no time to move camping spots. Panicking, we get our food hung, but his has too much weight and the branch keeps bending. The trees are mostly bare and have few sturdy branches. We try until there is almost no time left. In the near dark, he begins throwing large branches around next to a tree to try and cover his food. Something we both knew a bear could get to easily. We hustled to our individual tents and tried texting our coordinates to family, but had no luck. Neither of us had service. We held our knives closely that night. At about 3 a.m. I hear a loud scream and my friend's tent rolling around. In an utter panic, I open my tent flap, shine my headlamp, and there was no bear. His tent fell down in the snow. We laughed harder than ever and slept great the rest of the night. Story 3: My parents and I got lost in Grand Gulch for 2 days. On the tail end of a 5-day trip, we were exiting the canyon. The route seemed a lot more difficult than we anticipated. We knew there would be a faint trail, if any. But once we crested the rim, we found out we were way off course. Knowing the general direction we needed to head, we started walking and conserving water as much as we could, having left the multitude water pockets in the canyon below us. Slept that night under a pinyon pine and shared our last couple power bars, hoping to find some source of water the next day in the open desert. After a few miles the next morning, we finally came upon a faint road that became more pronounced as we went on. This road brought some good feelings, knowing we stashed a shuttle bike for someone to ride the last 8 or so miles to the van. Finally got to the bike cache and my stepdad hopped on as a rainstorm started rolling in. After half an hour or so, it turned to full downpour, which was great because we were thirsty as fuck. After walking what felt like an eternity and wondering where our damn ride was, we walked upon the primitive ass. Empty, other than our van, parking lot. We see my stepdad tearing through it trying to get the damn thing started. A dead battery. He ended up riding through thick mud another 6 miles to the highway to try to flag someone down. Ended up catching the eye of a ranger out patrolling who got us a tow and took us into Blanding, Utah while we got that bastard of a van running again. That felt like a lot for year-old me. Story 4. I should preface this by warning you that my horror story involves food poisoning, so maybe don't read this one over a meal. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 500 kilometers around much of the U.S. Along the way, I most often preferred to wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods at night, somewhere people were unlikely to find me, and even less likely to care that I was there. And I did this whole trip on my own. It was mid-November in southern Washington state, and I was overall having a pretty unremarkable day just biking all day. But in the afternoon, I started to come down with a bit of a stomachache. It wasn't bad enough to slow my progress on the bike, but it was certainly noticeable. Even so, I chose to wild camp that night, and as dusk approached, I pretty easily found somewhere to set up camp. After pitching my tent, I went through my usual bedtime routine, using my final few minutes of daylight to write in my journal and brush my teeth before going to bed right around dusk. However, pedaling 80 pounds, 36 kilograms, of bike and camping gear all day, every day is hungry work. I estimate I ate about 4,000 calories a day and still lost a few pounds. So it was a bit concerning on this particular night that I had little appetite for snacking as I went through my evening routine. After turning out my light and laying down, my stomach bug took a turn for the worse. I became nauseous, to the point that I would sit up in bed, hand on the zipper of my tent door, ready to open it up and lean out to vomit. But after sitting up for a long moment, the nausea would fade, and I'd lay back down. A few minutes later, I'd feel sick again. Finally, around 11:30 that night, I threw up. I used some water from one of my 2 bottles to rinse the vomit out of my mouth, drank a bit more water to replenish the fluids I'd lost, and laid down again. I actually managed to get some sleep, but only for 2 hours before I was once again woken by a feeling of nausea. I went through the whole thing again, feeling terrible, sitting up at the ready to throw up. The feeling faded away and then came back. Around 2:30, I finally threw up for a second time. Rinsed my mouth, drank some water, back to bed. Again at 4:30, I woke up. Thankfully, I didn't end up vomiting for a 3rd time, but I also knew I was unlikely to get back to sleep before sunrise. So while I waited for the sun to come up in a few hours, I made new plans. I felt terrible and really didn't want to get back on the bike, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to get back to civilization before my condition got any worse, and also because I'd used up all my water during the night. Thankfully, there was a town about 30 miles 50 kilometers ahead, which is a pretty easy day of biking for me when I'm in good health. And there was a decently cheap motel in that town. So I figured as soon as it was light out, I'd start biking to that town, get a room at the motel, and reassess my condition after a night of better rest. But as soon as it became light enough outside for me to get a move on, I began to hear the soft patter of rain hitting my tent. Checking the forecast on my phone, I didn't expect it to last long, and sure enough, the sound was gone after 20 minutes. Time to make my move. I put my bags outside, took down the tent, and loaded everything onto the bike. Pushed it back to the road, got on, and something felt weird. Getting off the bike, I quickly noticed a flat tire. Just my luck, right? But I had the tools, spare parts, and knowledge to fix it, and so I got to work. In my less than ideal mental condition, the flat took me far longer to repair than it had any right to, and by the time my bike was rolling again, the rain had returned. At this point, I had little other options than to put on my jacket, turn on my lights, and continue on my way. It wasn't even 8:00 a.m., and today was already by far the worst day of the 100 or so I'd been traveling up to that point. I was absolutely miserable. Every rotation of the pedals was a feat of Herculean strength. I was cold and wet. I was tired in every way, sleep-deprived, mentally exhausted, physically aching in every muscle of my body. I was hungry but didn't want to put too much food into my still very upset stomach. And I was dehydrated, as I'd run out of water the previous night. I struggle to recall a time, on my travels or back home, where I felt a more overwhelming sense of hopelessness. But finally, I arrived at that town. After a stop at the grocery store for some food that would be easier on my stomach, I headed to the motel. I got there an hour or 2 before the check-in time, but I must have looked as miserable as I felt, so the receptionist let me into a room early. After a long shower and a phone call home to my mom, I slept for 13 hours straight. The next morning, I woke up feeling much better. It was 60 miles, 100 kilometers, to a bigger city I'd been looking forward to visiting for quite some time. A fairly long day for me, even in the best of health, but the miles ticked by fairly easily, and I made it there by the early evening. The next day, however, the food poisoning would catch up to me while I was out at a museum, and so, the following day, I just took a rest day, staying in the hostel all day with the shits, TMI. I know, but you asked. That got it all out of my system, and the day after that, I was back to full strength. In hindsight, I'm just thankful that the diarrhea waited until I was back in civilization. While riding a bicycle across the country, I came down with food poisoning, the bike broke down on me, and then I had to ride through a cold rain all in one day, 10 tenths. Would still recommend bike camping.